Chapter 1. The Ledger of a Life. In the clear high mountain air of the town of Havenwood, the world was measured, weighed and recorded in the meticulous ledgers of Abigail Gable. At 67, Abigail was the proprietor of Gable's Mercantile, the town's general store, a role she had inherited from her parents and had upheld with a quiet, unshakable competence for her entire adult life. Her store was the town's anchor. It smelled of coffee beans and cured bacon, of leather harnesses and bolts of calico, of all the sensible, necessary things that kept a community running. Abigail herself was a woman of practicality. Her silver hair was always pinned in a neat, no-nonsense bun, her eyes a clear, observant grey that could spot a spoiled apple from 10 paces, and her hands were skilled in the arts of weighing flour-making change and keeping accounts that were balanced to the penny. She was a widow, her husband, a good and steady man named Thomas, having passed from a heart ailment a decade prior. He had been her partner in life and in business, and his absence was a permanent, neatly accounted for debit in the ledger of her heart. Her children were grown and gone, building lives in distant cities. Her life now was one of inventory and order, of providing for the town's needs while keeping her own carefully under wraps. She was respected, even admired for her efficiency and her fairness, but she was a woman who lived behind her counter, a barrier as much symbolic as it was physical. She had long ago traded the messy, unpredictable currency of deep emotion for the solid, reliable gold of routine. Chapter 2. The Man of Light and Shadow. Into her well-ordered world came a man who dealt in something she could not weigh or measure beauty. His name was Samuel Vance. He arrived on the autumn stagecoach, a man in his late 60s, with a quiet, gentle demeanour and eyes the colour of a faded summer sky. He was a travelling artist, a watercolorist who had spent the last few years of his life drifting through the West, trying to capture its transient, heartbreaking beauty on paper. Samuel was a man running from a different kind of past. He had been a successful architect in St. Louis, a designer of grand permanent structures. But a fire had destroyed his studio, taking with it not only his life's work, but also his beloved wife Eleanor, who had been trapped inside. Broken by the loss, he could no longer bear the thought of building things meant to last. He had abandoned his profession and taken up the fleeting, ephemeral art of watercolor, chasing the light he had lost, trying to find solace in capturing moments that were destined to fade. He came to Havenwood seeking lodging for the winter, drawn by the quality of the light and the dramatic beauty of the surrounding mountains. He was a quiet, unassuming presence, setting up his easel at the edge of town or by the creek, his skilled hands moving with a lifetime of practice, his gaze fixed on the way the afternoon sun turned the aspen trees to gold. Their first real meeting was a transaction. He came into Abigail's Mercantile to buy paper brushes and a new set of watercolors. Abigail, a woman of practicality, found the purchase frivolous. She sold him the supplies with her usual efficiency, but her gaze was tinged with a faint, unspoken disapproval for a grown man who spent his days playing with paint while others did real work. Samuel in turn saw her with an artist's eye. He saw the beautiful classical lines of her face, the quiet dignity in her posture, and the profound, deep-seated loneliness in her clear grey eyes. He saw a woman who had built a fortress around herself, and he felt a strange, unexpected pang of kinship. Chapter 3. An Unlikely Friendship. Their relationship began not with words, but with images. Samuel began to leave small, quick watercolor sketches for her on the counter when he came in for supplies. A sketch of her storefront in the morning light. A sketch of the old stray cat that slept on her porch. A sketch of her hands as she weighed out sugar. They were small, exquisite gifts, observations of the quiet beauty in her everyday world, a beauty she herself had long since stopped seeing. Abigail at first was flustered by the attention, but she could not deny the artistry. She began to keep the sketches, tucking them away in a drawer beneath the counter. In return, she started leaving a hot cup of coffee and a fresh pastry for him when she saw him setting up his easel on cold mornings. It was a silent, tentative dialogue, a friendship blooming in the space between her practicality and his art. He began to join her for coffee in the quiet hour after she opened the store. He was a gentle, intelligent man, and he coaxed stories from her she hadn't told in years. He didn't just want to know about inventory and sales. He wanted to know the history of the old clock on her wall, the story behind the faded photograph of her parents, the reason the town was named Havenwood. He was interested in the soul of the place, not just its function. She, in turn, began to ask about his work. He showed her how a wash of pale blue could become a winter sky, how a touch of dark ink could define the shadow of a mountain. He explained the nature of light, how it changed everything it touched, how his entire life was a chase to capture its fleeting magic. For the first time in a decade, Abigail felt the neatly ordered shelves of her world begin to shift. Samuel was showing her a different way of seeing, a way that valued not just the tangible and the permanent, but the beautiful and the ephemeral. The fortress around her heart began to show the first tiny cracks of light. Chapter 4. The Threat of the Modern World. The peace of their budding friendship and the quiet existence of Havenwood itself was shattered by a letter from the capital. It was from a large, faceless entity called the Western Development and Banking Corporation. The letter informed the town council that the bank had, through a series of acquisitions, become the holder of the mortgages on more than half of the businesses on Main Street, including Gable's Mercantile. The letter was followed by the arrival of a man named Alistair Finch, a slick, impeccably dressed vice president from the bank. Finch was the embodiment of the New West, a world of corporate ledgers, of consolidation, of ruthless efficiency. At a tense town meeting, Finch laid out the bank's plan. The mortgages were to be called in. The bank would foreclose and then redevelop the town. They would tear down the old, inefficient wooden buildings and replace them with modern, standardized brick storefronts. They would bring in a chain telegraph office, a company-owned hotel, and a franchise saloon. They would, he promised, turn Havenwood into a model town of the future. The townspeople were horrified. They were not just losing their businesses, they were losing their identity, their history. But they were trapped. Few had the capital to pay off their mortgages in full. Abigail was devastated. Her store, the work of 3 generations, the very anchor of her life, was to be torn down and replaced by a soulless brick box. She felt powerless, her lifetime of careful, practical work about to be swept away by a man with a pen in a distant city. That evening, Samuel found her sitting in her darkened store, her account books spread before her, as if she could find an answer in their neat, balanced columns. "This is wrong, Abigail," he said, his voice a low, angry hum. "But it is legal," she replied, her own voice hollow. It is business. It is the way of the world now. What can we possibly do? Samuel looked around the store at the warm, chaotic jumble of goods, at the history soaked into the very floorboards. He looked at Abigail, at the despair in her strong, proud face. "We fight back," he said, a strange new fire in his artist's eyes. Finch and his bank, they see this town as a list of assets on a balance sheet. They see lumber and land and square footage. They have no understanding of its true value. We must make them see. We must show them the soul of this place. And how do we do that? She asked, a flicker of her old practicality returning. With what weapons? We have no money, no power. No! Samuel said, a slow, determined smile spreading across his face. We have something they don't have. We have you. And we have me. We have the town's history, and we have the town's light. We will fight them with paper and paint. Chapter 5. The Portrait of a Town. Samuel's plan was as audacious as it was artistic. He proposed to create a portrait of the town. He would paint a series of large, detailed watercolors of Havenwood, not as it could be, but exactly as it was. He would paint the crooked porch of the general store, the weathered facade of the blacksmith shop, the quiet dignity of the church. He would capture the unique character, the history, the soul of the place on paper. Abigail at first thought the idea was madness. You want to fight a bank with paintings? Yes, he insisted. Because the bank's power comes from seeing this town as a number. We must force them and the world to see it as a place, as a home, as a work of art in its own right. Her practicality warred with the spark of hope he had ignited. She knew the town's stories, its history. He knew how to capture its light. It was a desperate, foolish plan. And it was the only one they had. Their collaboration began. It was an intimate, creative dance. Abigail became his historian, his guide. They would walk the streets together, and she would tell him the stories behind the buildings. That sagging roof on the livery, she'd say. That's from the great snow of '78. John Miller held it up with his own back for 2 hours to save his horses. Samuel would listen, his artist's eye, absorbing not just the shapes and colours, but the stories. He would then set up his easel and translate her words, her history, into light and shadow. He painted with a new urgency, a new purpose. His art was no longer just a private solace. It was a weapon. As he painted, Abigail began to see her town through his eyes. She saw the subtle beauty in the peeling paint, the character in the crooked doorway, the history in the worn cobblestones. He was showing her the poetry in her everyday practical world. And as she told him the town's stories, he began to see her differently. He saw the deep well of love she had for her community, the fierce protective spirit hidden beneath her reserved exterior. The line between their shared project and their shared affection blurred and then vanished completely. One evening, as they stood looking at a finished painting of her mercantile bathed in the warm glow of a sunset, he reached for her hand. "You know, Abigail," he said softly, "I came here to paint landscapes. But I have found that the most beautiful landscape in all of Havenwood is the one I see in you." In the quiet of the coming twilight, surrounded by the images of the town, they were fighting to save two lonely hearts, finally fully acknowledged their love for each other. Chapter 6. The Exhibition. They worked tirelessly. As the foreclosure deadline approached, Samuel had completed a dozen magnificent watercolors. They were not just paintings, they were love letters to the town of Havenwood. They planned their final desperate move. Abigail had learned through the town's telegraph operator that a journalist from a major Denver newspaper was passing through town on the very day that Finch was scheduled to finalize the foreclosures. On that day, they did not prepare for a fight. They prepared for an exhibition. They cleared the center of Gable's Mercantile, pushing aside sacks of flour and barrels of nails. On easels borrowed from Samuel's supplies, they displayed the 12 paintings, creating a stunning, immersive gallery in the heart of the store. The townspeople, hearing what was happening, began to gather. They walked through the makeshift gallery in hushed reverence. They saw their own homes, their own places of work, transformed by Samuel's art into things of profound beauty and significance. They saw not just buildings, but their shared life, their history, their home. A quiet, fierce pride began to fill the room. Alistair Finch arrived with the town sheriff, ready to serve the final foreclosure notices. He strode into the store expecting a scene of defeat. Instead, he found a room full of defiant townspeople standing silently among a gallery of beautiful paintings. He was momentarily speechless. At that moment, the journalist from Denver, drawn by the unusual crowd, walked in. "What's all this then?" the journalist asked. Abigail, her voice clear and strong, stepped forward. "This, sir," she said, gesturing to the paintings, "is the town of Havenwood. A town that Mr. Finch and his bank believe is worthless and which they intend to tear down." The journalist's eyes lit up. He saw the paintings. He saw the defiant faces of the townspeople. He saw the slick, angry face of the corporate banker. He smelled the story of a lifetime. A classic tale of the West, a small historic town fighting for its life against a faceless, greedy corporation. Finch saw it too. He saw the headlines. He saw the public relations nightmare. His company was not afraid of lawsuits. They were terrified of bad press. To be painted as the villain in a story that would be read across the nation was a disaster. He looked from the journalist's scribbling pen to the wall of paintings, to the unshakable dignity on Abigail's face and the quiet strength on Samuel's. He was beaten. Chapter 7. A future, painted with light. Faced with a public battle he could not win, the bank retreated. The foreclosure plan was postponed indefinitely. The town of Havenwood was saved. The exhibition in the general store became a permanent fixture, a testament to the battle they had won. Samuel Vance did not leave when the winter snows melted. He had found his home. He built a small studio behind the Mercantile, and his paintings of Havenwood and its surrounding landscapes became sought-after works of art. His greatest masterpiece, however, was the life he built with Abigail. Their love, born in the autumn of their lives, was a quiet, steady, and beautiful thing. They were partners in every sense of the word. They ran the store together, her practicality balancing his artistry. They spent their evenings in comfortable silence or deep conversation, their past sorrows not forgotten, but integrated into a new, richer shared present. One summer evening they stood on the porch of the Mercantile, watching the setting sun paint the sky with brilliant streaks of orange and purple. "You know," Abigail said, leaning her head on his shoulder, "I spent my whole life measuring things, making sure everything was accounted for. I thought that was what was real." Samuel put his arm around her. "And I spent my life chasing light, trying to capture something that could never be held," he said. He looked at her, his eyes full of a deep, abiding love. "It turns out," he continued, "that the only thing real is what we build together. You taught me how to put down roots, my practical, wonderful Abigail. You gave my art a home, and you, she whispered, her voice, full of a joy she had thought she would never feel again, taught me how to see the sky, my foolish, wonderful painter. You gave my home a soul. In the heart of the West, the woman of ledgers and the man of light had created their own masterpiece, a love story that was more beautiful and more permanent than any painting, a future they would continue to paint together day by glorious day.